I came to the decision of endorsing Ron Paul on this program early December, it was because of a look at what was happening, the status quo, who was in, who had been in, what was promised, what wasn't delivered, the direction we were going. To me, it was a logical conclusion that I would endorse Ron Paul. I was not aware of the predictions that Ron Paul had made back in 2002. I don't want to denigrate them by saying we could probably put him in the status of Miss Cleo. Call me now and I'll tell you what's going to happen. But thanks to our guest, David Grant, who's the political reporter for the Christian Science Monitor, he went back and took a look at what Ron Paul predicted in 2002. And I guess I could say accurately, somewhat accurately, and unfortunately true in many cases. Mr. Grant, welcome to the show.
Jerry, thanks for having me. Really excited to be here.
I'm going through this, and I teased it a little bit before we went to the break. And, I'm listening to Newt Gingrich last night wrongly taking credit for everything that happened in the past, and no one giving Ron Paul credit for the predictions that he made about the future that you write about in the Christian Science Monitor.
Yeah, well, we forget these things. If Ron Paul would have just quit that day and walked out and started a hedge fund, maybe he'd be personally better off for it. But, a lot of people are going back and digging through this stuff, and I think you look at what he said about sort of the economic implosion that's gone on in the last few years, and foreign policy, certainly with the Iraq War, and talking about Tony Blair, and then personal liberties. I mean, he hit three of the biggest, most hot-button issues today right on the head back in 2002. And, of course, the one thing that really hasn't come true, which is the dollar crisis and spiraling interest rates and, the debt crisis in the United States, that's the scariest one, and that one hasn't happened yet. But I don't think there's a 10-year statute of limitations on these things. So
yeah, yet is the key there, because if you take a look at the policy of the Fed, the collusion of the Treasury, the injection of these monies, and I hear Ben Bernanke, who's just a college professor, as he said himself. If I take a look at the actions of Tim Geithner and his former counterpart, Shifty Paulson, they say they have the tools that's going to eliminate the liquidity in the system at the appropriate moment so that we can head off or avoid any of this inflationary environment that might be in front of us. And I don't know many people out there besides those three who believe that that's possible. But let's go through a couple of the things that you write about here in your piece, dcdecoder.com. A Christian Science Monitor is the article, The Prophecies of Ron Paul. Our guest, David Grant, the author. During the next decade, the American people will become poorer, less free, while more dependent on the government for economic security, a long, steep drop in the American standard of living. Well, would that not be the record number of people on unemployment insurance, food stamps, living below the poverty line, et cetera?
Sure. I mean, some of this is, the last economic recession we had that was this deep, obviously, was the Great Depression, and a lot of those programs weren't in existence. So in some ways, that was the plan, and whatever you think about, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, he hit it right on the head, right? We have these things in place. He was overall bearish about the American economy, and I know he's reiterated that recently on your show, saying he'd like to short the American economy, or short the American government at least if he could. So,
right.
That is, right on point. And in terms of the long, steep drop in America's standard of living, I mean, that's well documented across all sorts of things. I mean, national wealth in terms of, debt to what people have going on in terms of their personal economics. It's a tough scene, and again, he did point that out. 2002.
The second item you bring up in your piece is class warfare. I guess we can say that that's the 1%ers versus the 99%ers, the Tea Party versus Occupy Wall Street. How many other people back then, Mr. Grant, were predicting that there would be agitation? And the way you write this is interesting, and the way he spoke about this, agitation for more class warfare. And I'm thinking, who wants more class warfare other than the existing ruling class?
Yeah, well, Congressman Paul has been but he has been less critical of the Occupy Wall Street folks than certainly any of the other candidates in the GOP field. Notably Herman Cain initially, who talked about them as saying, go out and get a job. I mean, the reason that this is so profound, I think, is that he's not just saying, look at you, Occupy Wall Street, shame on you. He's also saying, the 1%ers, the people who are pushing back on this from the other side, you guys are kind of agitating for the same sort of thing too. So he didn't say, the proletariat was going to rise up, or he didn't say, it was going to be a war of rich people against poor people. It was going to be, it was going to be agitation for more class warfare, and that's pretty interesting phrasing, as you pointed out.
And you say less critical of Occupy Wall Street. I was not as critical of Occupy Wall Street. I mean, it's easy to just say a bunch of pot-smoking hippies banging on the drums and, urinating in jars. That's the easy way to go, which was even some of the ways that John Boehner went, Eric Cantor went. But there were others out there that then started to come around, like John Boehner. Well, I can understand why they might be a little ticked off. Eric Cantor, we have to understand that maybe these problems run a little bit deeper than envy or jealousy, or Eric Erickson at Red State, Colin Powell. A lot of the people said, don't discount the Occupy Wall Street agitation. And I think Ron Paul was smart enough to understand that that was happening even before it was happening when he made the prediction back in 2002. The United States, third point you have with Tony Blair as head cheerleader, will attack Iraq, major war, the largest since World War II. Now, who would have ever predicted that what we were doing in Iraq would exceed our efforts in World War II?
Yeah, well, in terms of time, as Newt Gingrich always points out, Afghanistan made it there as well. So, he was on point with that. And again, this was in 2002. This was even before the invasion, before this was a done deal in 2003.
You also talk about government will grow to record levels, which is what you're paraphrasing Ron Paul is saying in 2002.
Yeah, I mean, his general point is that both Democrats and Republicans want the expansion of government, and that they'll have this trade-off where Democrats will get the expansion of the welfare state, Republicans will get more security spending, national defense spending, and everyone can go back to their district happy and say they did what they were supposed to do in Washington. Unfortunately, he then connects this very quickly into the erosion of civil liberties. The government grows, you become more dependent on it, and you start to see these things erode. So it's not only that the government got bigger, but the government got more a part of people's lives. And I think the most recent manifestation of this would be the National Defense Authorization Act.
Right. And which the NDAA, which people are now talking about, he was looking at back then and just saying, where are we going with this? And I think he said in the debate the other night, be careful how quickly you want to turn your back on the American legal system. Be careful how quickly you're willing to give up your rights and your liberties. And for Democrats listening to Republicans talk, any legislation in that area would be a power grab. For Democrats listening to Democrats talk about it, it would be the right thing to do. What I caution people to take a look at is you might be comfortable with that right now, but what happens when your guys or gals aren't in power and someone else gets a hold of that power? What are they going to do with that power? And once government gets power, it doesn't want to give it up.
Right. When the person who did the signing statement is no longer in office. I mean, and this is the thing with Barack Obama, certainly, and people on the left, like people on Salon.com, Glenn Greenwald, have gone after the president on this, saying, you'll put a missile into somebody in Yemen, you'll kill them, but you promise us that you won't detain them indefinitely. And so I think that's right. It's a good point, when the tables are turned. And I think this is part of the appeal of Ron Paul, is that he does it is robust in certain ways, certainly on the civil rights or sort of civil rights and liberties front. That it's not just a Republican philosophy or a Democratic philosophy, and you see this at his rallies or, in the fact that a lot of young people, independent-minded people support him, that it does actually flip to both sides. It has an answer for both people on the left and people on the right.
Talking with David Grant, political reporter, Christian Science Monitor, his piece, The Prophecies of Ron Paul. There are many other points that you bring up, and I recommend people go and read this article, dcdecoder.com, Christian Science Monitor, David Grant, the author, The Prophecies of Ron Paul. Without getting into a lot of the other specific points, I'd like to just get your input on this, Mr. Grant, as to why, when you look at these kind of what I call finger on the pulse of the trends, and kind of a call to action to just be aware of which way we're headed, there seems to be very little effort on the part of the Republican Party to tout a candidate that was so right on so many issues so many years ago.
Well, it's got to be hard if you have candidates that are perhaps unwilling or less willing. Their records are not quite as homogeneous as Congressman Paul's is. And the other thing is that Congressman Paul is coming from outside of the Republican mainstream. And I think one of the things that this election has shown us is that he is sort of broken through. he's really changed the trajectory of the GOP, whether it's talking about foreign policy. I mean, you had Rick Perry following him and other people talking in very Paulian terms, if you will, about what to do with foreign aid. You had the same thing going on with economics and talking about the Federal Reserve. I mean, Rick Perry really started his campaign by criticizing Ben Bernanke in sort of harsh terms. So
right.
I think that in the past, certainly the Republican Party hasn't been holding this person up, but he sort of punched his way to the table. And I think going forward, that's going to have big ramifications for them, not only this year, but in the future with his son Rand.
I was reading Kimberly Strassel's op-ed piece today in the Wall Street Journal, What Ron Paul Wants, and she says his real aim is to take the party hostage. Well, based upon the predictions he had in 2002, I wouldn't use the term take the party hostage, but maybe the party should take some of Ron Paul's predictions to heart, and maybe she wouldn't have to make excuses like saying that the GOP has long been the party of limited government, because they're not. And he was well ahead of the trends on the Fed, auditing the Fed, monetary supply, what it is we're doing with our central bank, how we have to take a look at what the Treasury is doing and pushing a button and printing money. Maybe they should embrace rather than accuse him of trying to take the Republican Party hostage.
Yeah, I think you said on your show, that people come to Washington and then being in office is more important than solving problems. And he's never really had that problem. He always assumed he could go back and do something else and be a doctor, when it didn't work out for him in the political world. And so I think that, there certainly is a robustness to what he says. There's a depth to what he says, but it is counterintuitive to the sort of mainstream political culture for a long time. And I think what you're seeing now, again, with the traction that he's getting, the fact that he is one of the last 4 people on stage, it may not be happening now, but he certainly set this up. In some ways, right. You could argue when you look back at this race 10 years from now, whether Mitt Romney wins or Newt Gingrich wins or Ron Paul wins or Barack Obama wins, I mean, the most significant thing that will have gone on in the Republican Party, one might say, is the ascension of libertarian ideas and sort of Ron Paul's entire contingent of ideas and background and history and thoughts. I mean, it's really sort of shifted the way the party's gone. So, yes, in the past, they've been sort of pushing him away from the center, certainly. But now, as I said, he's there and he's not going anywhere. So,
right. It's interesting to watch it take place. And when I endorsed Ron Paul, it wasn't so much that I endorsed just the man as I was endorsing the movement. That if you take a look at what we've done, it's not working. You get capitalism under Bush, you get socialism under Obama, you get bigger government, more in debt, with more entitlements, with less accountability, and the good old boy and gal system lives on, the few benefiting at the expense of the many. And I think if anything that is good coming out of this economic downturn and this kind of this financial undetermined prison sentence that people are suffering through, that this is exposing a lot of the crony capitalists, the entrenched politicos, the political patronage, and people look at it and saying, well, maybe the doctor isn't a witch doctor. Maybe the doctor actually is somebody that we should listen to. I appreciate it. David Grant, I enjoyed talking with you. Check out his piece at the Christian Science Monitor. David Grant is the political reporter for the Christian Science Monitor in Washington, D.C., dcdecoder.com. You can just Google Christian Science Monitor, a really good piece that he wrote called The Prophecies of Ron Paul. David Grant, thank you, sir.